Now that's the first part of the talk really presented in relation to the period up to the passing of Shoghi Effendi, from the beginning of the century, the pattern of three processes taking place. They're really three processes, as two parts of one. Outside the faith, there are two things happening, both of which relate to the breaking down of the barriers among human beings. One of these processes is generally seen as being very destructive, and it's usually also very uncomfortable for human beings because barriers they've been used to disappear. And you don't have to describe what they are, you see it yourselves in the world. Tensions that have existed in the past blow up into wars, into trials that people have to overcome. Then the second part of this process is the broadening of the area of collaboration in the world, and the raising up of institutions in the world, fostering unity and harmony. These two things are happening simultaneously outside the faith. And naturally, the faith is aware of it, all the Baha'is are part of this. But parallel with this, as the Guardian points out, is the process of the faith itself, which is the rise and establishment and perfecting of the present, the gift that Baha'u'llah has brought to mankind. We've got to a stage in evolution where there is a sudden advance forward. Now, evolution, apparently, the more they study it, proceeds in this way. It isn't just a steady advance. There are great surges, which mankind then gets used to. And this has been detected by many people over these past years. H.G. Wells, for example, he was one of the writers and editors of what he called an outline of history, which is, I think, a brilliant work, really trying to tackle the history of the world as distinct from just separate little histories of parts of it. And it has an interesting feature, inasmuch there was a board of editors. And every now and again you find that some of the editors didn't agree with what had been finally done, so you have a little footnote about commenting that we don't think it was quite like this, it was like something else, which makes it a very interesting book. But this book presents towards the end this concept of mankind having reached a new stage in evolution. And they point out, Wells points out, that there's no reason why Homo sapiens, as a whatever it is, should survive any more than anything else. The dinosaurs went out. History is full of species being destroyed and changing and coming to being. So he points out this point of human history requires mankind to make an enormous step forward. If not, it'll just drop out of history. Now, he was very hopeful when writing that volume, but later in life he wrote a second smaller history book, and he warns us that he's an old man by this time, but he's very much discouraged. He says, as far as he can see, there are a few human beings are going to seize the possibilities to understand what is happening to mankind and rise to the challenge. But he fears that the vast majority won't bother about it. They'll carry on with their normal work and gradually just disappear. So that part of mankind, he came to the conclusion because of this, that mankind in fact was on its way out. Naturally we don't believe that, but we see the same process happening. It isn't just that many people oppose the unity of mankind, but vast numbers of people aren't interested in that. They're interested in their own particular little businesses, and they go away at that, ignoring the effects on the rest of mankind. So this is the pattern that the book portrays. These two advances, or two changes in the world as a whole, but above all, the importance of the rise of the faith. To a non-Baha'i sociologist, the rise of the faith may at this time seem to be a very minor issue. But it's like the beginnings of almost everything. The very beginnings are almost imperceptible. But understanding as we do that Baha'u'llah is the manifestation of God who is sent here precisely to raise mankind to the next stage of its evolution, we know that every aspect of the development of the faith is of tremendous importance for the whole of mankind. And that really is also what this book is about. The central theme of this book is about the rise and establishment of the Baha'i order in this period of the 20th century. We got as far as last time as in history as the passing of Shoghi Effendi. How many of the friends here actually were Baha'is during the time of Shoghi Effendi? You put up your hand, anyone who was? 1, 2, 3. Were Baha'is during the lifetime of Shoghi Effendi? You were, obviously, yes?
But I did not see him.
No, you don't have to see him. Just how many Baha'is are here from that period? Before, how many were Baha'is knows before November 1957? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, you see, it's not a lot. 5. It shows how much the faith has grown since those days. But it was, of course, to the Baha'is of that period, the passing of the Guardian was completely unexpected and absolutely shattering. And this period immediately following the passing of Shoghi Effendi is of tremendous importance in the history of the faith. One couldn't see it approaching, but looking back you can see certain things that the Guardian did. And Ruhiyya Khanum said he himself didn't seem to foresee his passing, and I was consciously, and she should know, he was talking with her. But his action, for example, in one of his last messages, in referring to the hands of the cause as the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world commonwealth, was crucial to the unity of the faith. Now, it wasn't that he appointed them as that. He simply said that's what the hands are, and they would have been so if he continued to live. But you see the significance of that title when he died. A steward is someone who's in charge of the place for the boss. And if the boss isn't there, or he dies and the heir can't take over, he keeps running. He's running. And that's what the hands did. And they're the chief stewards, because there's another place where the Guardian refers to the National Assemblies as stewards of the Baha'i World Commonwealth. So these were the chief stewards, which again is important because it let the National Assemblies know where they should turn. Now, we saw Ruhiyya Khanum at that time and marveled at her strength, because as anyone could see, she'd be absolutely shattered at such an event. I mean, he wasn't only her guardian, he was her dearly loved husband. And they'd gone through very hard times together. And she just simply drew together everybody. She stood at his grave anointing the friends as we went by his funeral. She was the one that gathered all the hands together and persuaded them to meet in Baha'i. I don't think they had any resistance to doing that, but she had to get them together. And it wasn't easy because the faith was still very much both Eastern and Western. The laws of the faith which had been applied in Iran had mostly not yet been applied in the West. So even the hands of the cause had to recognize that the Guardian had applied the laws and principles of the faith in accordance to the stage of development and the capacities of the Baha'is in the different parts of the world. And that took quite a bit of rethinking. I've heard her say several times more recently, however, there were two things which upheld her after the Guardian passed away. One was some years before, I think it was years before, some time before anyway. One day the Guardian, when writing or at his desk, suddenly said to her, "What will you do after me?" And she was horrified. She said, "Choki Effendi didn't say that." Well, he was a young man still. He was desperately upset that he was talking about his dying. And he just ignored her protests and said, "You will travel and encourage the friends." He did, then he went on to some other subject. I don't know whether it was an instruction or just he saw what she would do. And of course that's where she felt she should do that after he passed away. When they were in London, the Guardian had been ill with Asiatic flu, and he'd been working hard on the maps of the 10-year crusade, and he had a tremendous burden with the 10-year crusade. It had been going wonderfully at first, then it was slowing down. He was very worried about it, and he was exhausted. And he suddenly said to Ria Khanum, "I can't go back to Haifa. I won't go. You must go ahead of me, and you'll know what to do." And again she was rather taken aback, but at that point it seemed to her that she was going ahead of him and would do it. But she knew afterwards this had a more profound implication, and again strengthened her that he should say, you will know what to do. So she gave her the confidence to gather the hands together, to encourage the Baha'i world to turn to the hands. And all the way through the ministry of the custodians, the hands were encouraging the friends, stimulating them, and preserving the unity of the faith, because it was very difficult. There were Baha'is discussing in all sorts of ways whether there would be a guardian or there wouldn't be a guardian, and could get very het up about it. And so the hands kept on saying, "Don't speculate." And that they held the faith together in that way, and then eventually handed over to the Universal House of Justice. There was the event, of course, of the breaking of the covenant by Charles Mason Reamy in 1961. That one of the hands should break the covenant was an incredible experience. And they really didn't know what to do. It's well worth reading that book, The Ministry of the Custodians, which Rahir Khanum wrote, simply because it gives you a picture of how things that were happening and how the hands had to cope with things in those days. That was the first big blow, was the passing of the breaking of the covenant by Mason Reamy. Then there was a second one, which I don't know if that book even mentions. But in Haifa and Akka, there were quite a number of Baha'is still. When I went there first in '61, it was a very funny situation when there was a meeting of the community. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it just felt a bit strange. And then we found out what was happening. The covenant-breaking members of the family had infected a number of the Baha'is living in the Holy Land. And one day in 1962, it's shortly before the election of the House of Justice, one of the very loyal Baha'is from Haifa happened to go and visit one of the Baha'is in Akka and found him sitting having tea with a whole lot of covenant breakers. So it was clear that the loyal Baha'is in Akka, or some of them, were just hand in hand with the covenant breakers. So at that point the hands had to interview all the Baha'is living in the Holy Land. The Baha'is had been there for a long time. And the majority of them persisted in their attitude and were expelled from the faith. Now this was a problem the hands didn't need at that particular point. But it gives you an idea of why the hands were so desperately eager that nothing should interfere with the proper and pure election of the Universal House of Justice. So they went to every single extreme to be sure that nothing would go wrong, and nothing did go wrong. One problem was, I think there were one or two Baha'is had obviously started traveling around the world, giving talks everywhere and giving money for haziras and so on. It looked very nice, and Baha'is were very happy to have been given haziras and so on. But it was quite clear, knowing from Haifa, knowing who these people were and what their attitude was, that they were, as it were, sort of tacitly electioneering to be elected to the House of Justice. And the Hands worried. He said, what should we do? Should we say something? But that's an interference. So they decided they could do nothing. They had to leave it to God. And the result, I think, showed the wisdom and the common sense of the members of the national assemblies around the world. Because these people who'd been doing this, nowhere near elected. So there was everything went straightforwardly without any problem, and they had the House of Justice. And once the House of Justice came into being, of course, immediately the hands of the cause of God turned to the House of Justice. I remember a meeting where Paul Haney, who was, as it were, looking after the funds for the Hands, came and met with the Universal House of Justice and explained there were funds around, and at that point handed over $100,000 to the House of Justice to get on with while we were getting things sorted out. And all the time, therefore, the Hands just kept things running, ready to hand anything over at any time, as soon as the House of Justice was ready for it. The House of Justice used to meet with the Hands regularly to discuss problems. There was I'm giving you these little side issues, as it were, just to give you an explanation of the sort of things that had to be coped with and how the Hands helped the House. There's a village in Jordan called Adasiya, and it was founded actually on land which was meant to be endowment land for the support of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. And this was a beautiful Baha'i village with a local spiritual assembly. Abdul Baha went and stayed in the local Hazira, and he called it the Blessed Village of Adasiya. And later, alas, the covenant breakers infected that village to the point that the Guardian said, alas, it has become the accursed village of Adasiya. Now what happened was the members of the family who broke the covenant had the title deeds to Adasiya. And the Guardian said, right, that's their legal property, they can have it. At one point, the covenant breakers were trying to get a lot of the title deeds, and he said, you can take anything, but I must have the shrines. He held the shrines in his hand because he had to protect them. But Adasiya was one of the bits of property that went into the hands of the covenant-breaking members of the family. And so the Guardian made the covenant breakers and the tenants in Adasiya come to an agreement. And the agreement was that the tenants were never to be sent off the land. They had a right to be tenants. The covenant breakers were not to dismiss them. On the other hand, the tenants were never to obtain even a square meter of ownership of the land. The ownership must remain with the owners, who were the covenant breakers. Now what happened at this point, after the election of the House of Justice, was that the covenant breakers had fled away from Jordan, and the Jordanian government had nationalized the land and were giving the land of former landowners to the tenants. And so the tenants in Adasiya wrote to the House of Justice and said, can we accept this land from the government? And then the House of Justice consulted the hands of the cause, and we had the whole background, and answered the tenants, said no, the Guardian has insisted this agreement be signed and you must remain true to it. You cannot accept a square meter of that land. If they allow you to continue to farm there, God bless you, but no, you can't accept it to own it. And the Baha'is of Adasiya obeyed. And it wasn't too long after that the Palestinian Liberation Organization moved into the area and drove out the people from that area, and the Baha'is went and lived in another part of Jordan, and that became a little center of attacks on Israel. But it was this knowledge of the past that was so valuable from the hands to the House of Justice to know what to answer in particular situations like this. And there are lots of these things happening. You don't find them in Baha'i News because it was a local problem. Now in the world as a whole, there was a profound, development had taken place in the attitude of human beings through the first part of the century. I hope to get the right one here. Where are we? Yeah. You know, after the war, you had the Cold War. Everyone was happily over the war with the Axis powers. Then, of course, there was the tension between the East and the West. And I'll read you this passage from, I'll read you more than I originally intended because I think you need to see the whole picture. It's on pages 88 and 89 of this book. It says, since the driving force of colonialism itself was economic exploitation, it was perhaps inevitable that most movements of liberation assumed a broadly socialistic ideological cast. Within only a few short years, these circumstances had created a fertile ground for exploitation by the world's superpowers. For the Soviet Union, the situation seemed to offer an opportunity to induce a shift in the existing alignment of nations by gaining a preponderating influence in what was by now beginning to be called the Third World. The response of the West, wherever development aid failed to retain the loyalties of recipient populations, was to resort to the encouragement and arming of a wide variety of authoritarian regimes. And as outside forces manipulated new governments, attention was increasingly diverted from an objective consideration of developmental needs to ideological and political struggles that bore little or no relation to social or economic reality. The results were uniformly devastating. Economic bankruptcy, gross violations of human rights, the breakdown of civil administration, and the rise of opportunistic elites who saw in the suffering of their countries only openings for self-enrichment. Such was the heartbreaking fate that engulfed one after another of the new nations who only short years before had begun life with such great promise. Inspiring these political, social, and economic crises was the inexorable rise and consolidation of a disease of the human soul, infinitely more destructive than any of its specific manifestations. Its triumph marked a new and ominous stage in the process of social and spiritual degeneration that Shoghi Effendi had identified. Fathered by 19th century European thought, acquiring enormous influence through the achievements of American capitalist culture, and endowed by Marxism with the counterfeit credibility peculiar to that system, materialism emerged full-blown in the second half of the 20th century as a kind of universal religion, claiming absolute authority in both the personal and social life of humankind. Its creed was simplicity itself. Reality, including human reality and the process by which it evolves, is essentially material in nature. That's the creed. The goal of human life is, or ought to be, the satisfaction of material needs and wants. Society exists to facilitate this quest, and the collective concern of humankind should be an ongoing refinement of the system aimed at rendering it ever more efficient in carrying out its assigned task. So these, of course, are all the benevolent things, nevertheless infused with materialism. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, impulses to devise and promote any formal materialistic belief system disappeared. Nor would any useful purpose have been served by such efforts, as materialism was soon facing no significant challenge in most parts of the world. Religion, where not simply driven back into fanaticism and unthinking rejection of progress, became progressively reduced to a kind of personal preference, a predilection, a pursuit designed to satisfy spiritual and emotional needs of the individual. The sense of historical mission that had defined the major faiths learned to content itself with providing religious endorsement for campaigns of social change carried on by secular movements. The academic world, once the scene of great exploits of mind and spirit, settled into the role of a kind of scholastic industry, preoccupied with tending its machinery of dissertations, symposia, publication, credits, and grants. Whether as worldview or simple appetite, materialism's effect is to leach out of human motivation and even interest the spiritual impulses that distinguish the rational soul. Is it the resulting in the absence of conviction about the spiritual nature of reality and the fulfillment it alone offers, it is not surprising to find at the very heart of the current crisis of civilization a cult of individualism that increasingly admits of no restraint and that elevates acquisition and personal advancement to the status of major cultural values. The resulting atomization of society has marked a new stage in the process of disintegration about which the writings of Shoghi Effendi speak so urgently. So that, in other words, is the significance of what was happening in the second half of the 20th century outside the Baha'i faith. I'm trying to avoid the sun. Now the victory of the 10-year crusade and the election of the Universal House of Justice are in themselves an extraordinary turning point in the history of mankind. People don't talk much about it nowadays, but of course there was a prophecy of Daniel, which used to be referred to before the end of the crusade, of the tremendous significance of this time. It would cause the whole of mankind to rejoice. It's come and gone, most of mankind have ignored it, but we shouldn't forget this prophecy. Now, for some 37 years, the cause progressed along two tracks. One was expansion and consolidation, and the second was increasing influence in society. In other words, the first is really ourselves and gathering in more mankind into the faith, training them in the teachings, upbuilding Baha'i laws. The second is doing what we can to aid mankind by sharing the message with them so far as they can absorb it and affecting the way that human beings deal with their problems. I think it was as long ago as the constitutional movement in Iran, where, or maybe later, I think certainly in the time of Abdul Baha, that he commented to some people that, look, even if you don't accept the claims of Baha'u'llah, try the system that he recommends. If you don't like it, you can always give it up. But this is there for you to try it. He said the same thing about war once, but, you know, it's mankind has been fighting throughout its history. We should at least try peace. If it doesn't work, we can always go back to war again. So with this double process taking place in the world, the House of Justice established a series of teaching plans, very similar to the ones the Guardian had established in the world. I'll tell you when they were, because I always get confused myself of when they take place. The first of all, there was the 9-year plan from 64 to 73, and there was a year of respite after that. The 5-year plan, 74 to 79, a 7-year plan from 79 to 86, a 6-year plan for 86 to 92. Now that was followed in 92 by the Holy Year, the centenary of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. And then the whole pattern began to change. One reason was the increase in the volatility of human behavior and the situation in the world. The House of Justice felt unable to project long plans. So after 62, you have a 3-year plan from 93 to 96. then a 4-year plan from 96 to 2000, and then a 12-month plan from 2000 to 2001, up to the end of the 20th century. And you know now there's 2 more 5-year plans followed after that. The 4-year plan marked a major change within the Baha'i community. It wasn't sudden, it was part of the gathering of the experience of the past. Because as these plans have gone ahead, there was a progressive decentralization of the planning process. It became impossible to plan everything from the world center. Not only impossible, but undesirable. So more and more the planning was pushed down to the National Assembly level with the assistance of the councillors' advice and the auxiliary board members. It took the National Assembly quite a time to work out what the fixing of goals meant. Quite a lot of them simply sent a list of goals that were nothing more than wish lists, hadn't borne no relationship to the capacity of the community. And with an increase in the size of the community, it became more and more difficult to fix numerical goals, for example. When you have 20 assemblies, you can make a nice goal of double the number of the assemblies. When you have 1,500 assemblies, if you can double them, why can't you triple them? You know, the number is so enormous. You can't give that sort of thing. Some national assemblies wanted to have goals of so many new believers. And the House of Justice said, no, that's not within your capacity. You can't decide who's going to become Baha'is. You can have goals for what you're going to do. And you can open new territories, you can form local assemblies. But to say that so many people are going to become Baha'is is not a feasible goal. So we had to always continue to concentrate on what the Baha'is should do. And over this period, gradually, the assemblies and learned better and better how to plan. And of course, at the same time, the boards of councillors and the auxiliary board members were learning their functions. It took quite a long time for the believers to really understand what councillors were, what they were meant to do, how they fitted into the whole structure. Because some Baha'is, you know, this is, I was warned again, the thing I was saying the other day, try not to double guess what things mean for the future. We have to accept as Baha'is that because this is the kingdom of God on earth and we're receiving divine guidance through the House of Justice and through the Guardian and Ampleforth, there are things we don't know and we can't know. It's God's business. So we shouldn't try and cook things up for ourselves before they're ready for delivery to us. One of the things the friends thought up, some friends, not many, after the passing of the Guardian, was that the institution of the hands of the cause was a temporary thing. Rather like a scaffolding when you're going to build a building. That the real essence of the faith, the real administrative order, was the Universal House of Justice, the National Assemblies, local assemblies. And this other arm was a sort of funny excrescence which we seem to have around. And the real explanation was it's only a temporary thing, and once it's built up the national and local assemblies, then it'll disappear. Which is a complete misunderstanding of the whole basis, but it shows how people, by trying to explain away things they find uncomfortable, can get into all sorts of difficult situations. When we find something in the faith uncomfortable, we have to try and educate ourselves into being comfortable with it. And to understand it by understanding it in its full context. And we shouldn't be ashamed that it takes us time. We're only ordinary human beings. We're the ones that God was able to get to accept his faith after the real invitees turned it down. I mean, the kings of the world and the leaders of the churches should have become Baha'is. They didn't. Okay, we've got to struggle and do what we can. One thing that happened during this period, up to the 4-year plan, of course, was the large-scale conversion of people into the faith. It started, I think, in Africa, and then spread to the Pacific and Latin America and India. India was extremely rapid. And how to deal with that was a thing we had to learn. Isabel Sabri, was one of the counselors at the International Teaching Center, and she was a pioneer to Africa. She first pioneered to Britain, and she was a pioneer to Britain, I remember, when I became a Baha'i. And she married Hassan Sabri, and they pioneered to Africa. And she was on pilgrimage talking to the Guardian about the time that Uganda was having vast numbers of new Baha'is. And she was very worried because quite a large number of these new Baha'is left the faith again. And she said this to the Guardian, what are we going to do? He says, don't worry. He says, the time will come when people will flow in and out of the faith like a tide. The essential thing is never close the doors. In other words, we should accept that some people, it isn't that the ones who take a long time to accept the faith are necessarily deeper than the ones who accept them in 2 days. It's just that different people react in different ways. And people change their minds, and they're free to change their minds. So we should welcome people. I mean, we don't want to be stupid and say, can you say Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, all right, you're a Baha'i. That's ridiculous. But we should understand when people say they really do believe that we should accept them and try and integrate them into the community and not be worried that some should then go out again. That's their right. But we have to know how to consolidate the community as it grows. And this is the big difficulty. Isabel said one day it was rather like water going into the desert, because the pioneers would teach a number of Baha'is, who would teach a lot of other Baha'is, who would teach a lot of other Baha'is, and each stage knew less and less and less about the faith. And so you ended up with communities that called themselves Baha'is but knew virtually nothing about the faith, and therefore their lives as communities didn't change. And people would say, well, what are we Baha'is for? It's the same as it was before. That was some of the reactions. On the other hand, in some cases, the conversion was surprisingly profound. There's a story even in Sweden of, there's a newspaper notice about an unusual man living in a certain area who fasted every year. And as I said, when he fasted in the spring, the Baha'is were interested in this and got in touch with him. And he was thrilled to bits to learn the Baha'is in Sweden. He had become a Baha'i when he worked in Chicago at the time of the building of the temple. And he'd gone back to Sweden, and there were, as far as he knew, no Baha'is in Sweden. And for all these years, all he really knew about the faith was its greeting was Allahu Akbar, that they had prayers, and there was a fast once a year. And he faithfully kept the fast all those years, knowing he was a Baha'i without knowing anything more about the faith. And every now and again you'll find a community like that which accepts the faith, gets the essence. In other words, Baha'u'llah is the manifestation of God for this age and I'm his follower. And they'll stay like that for years and years until someone gets in touch with the poor soul and they come into the community. So there are people who will cling on like this, but most human beings, if they can't do anything with the belief they've got, tend to wander off into other activities. So the great thing that communities have to learn is how to simultaneously teach the faith, consolidate the faith of the new believers, and bring them into the workforce of the community. So that new believers aren't a burden, they're an added strength. And this is really what started in the four-year plan. The 12-month plan, which followed that, was to bring into the community's understanding the vital importance of the education of children. So many communities have lost whole generations of children, partly through a misunderstanding. We know very well that nobody should just follow blindly the religion of their fathers. This is, Abdu'l-Baha says this again and again. That's true. But it doesn't mean to say that parents should not teach their children the faith. Parents surely teach their children all the truth they possibly can. Why would one hold back from one's children the most important truth you know? Now, the way you teach the children, the way one encourages the children to think for themselves, to understand, to question what you're telling them, to really understand the faith, this is vital. But it isn't indoctrination to teach one's children the faith. It's giving them the truth that one has. And sooner or later, as you know, about the age of 15, the children have the responsibility to take the burden on their own shoulders. And then, some do, some don't. And we should continue with the connection with the children. I mean, simply because children don't become Baha'is doesn't mean they aren't our children anymore. And you can't break these links. There's all sorts of links one establishes in life which remain. I remember talking once to a mother whose daughter had been married, and they had a child, and then they were divorced. And the former husband of the girl said to the grandmother one day that they were no longer related. He wasn't divorced. He said, "What do you mean we're no longer related?" He said, "That's your daughter, isn't it? The little baby." He says, "Yes." "Well, it's my granddaughter. Marriage is broken, but not the fact that your daughter is my granddaughter." So in life you build up connections which just can't get severed. There are relationships, and there should be one thing about one's family, I think, is a blessing, is that one never really loses touch with one's family. People you meet in the street and you talk about the faith to, you may never see them again. But thank God our family is somewhere around, so it's never too late. One has this link with the family, one's extended family. But this business of teaching the children is so very important. The House of Justice had this whole 12-month plan concentrating on the teaching of children before it moved into the first 5-year plan. Now, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, of course, is for the whole of humanity. It's not our religion. And it's our responsibility to share it with mankind and to use the teachings as well as we can in our participation in the troubles and activities of mankind. The persecutions in Iran, which suddenly burst out with such renewed vigor in 1979, produced a tremendous education of the national spiritual assemblies around the world. People who had no skill in diplomatic work, probably just ordinary citizens going about their business, suddenly found that the House of Justice said, "Please go and see the Prime Minister and say so and so and so and so." This was very difficult for a lot of friends. They had to screw up their courage to do this sort of thing. But they did it. They struggled, they prayed. And there's a story which I've often told, I hope you haven't all heard it too often. But it's reliance on Baha'u'llah that helps Baha'is do things that we think are impossible. There was this story I'm telling you, there was a case when the House of Justice wanted a letter to be got into the hands of I think it was the president of an Arab country who was visiting Europe. And it asked a National Assembly to get a letter sent by the House of Justice into the hands of the ambassador of that country to give to the president when he was in Europe. So the Secretary of the Assembly had this letter which the House had sent, and he got in touch with the embassy of this country and asked if he could have an interview with the ambassador to hand over a letter. And they said, "Yes, most certainly, we'll arrange that." And nothing happened. He reminded them, and they said, "Well, they haven't been able to do anything quite yet, but..." And he reminded them again, still nothing was happening. And so he realized it's the usual deal, that nothing was going to happen. So he thought to himself, what is it that I haven't done that I could do? And he said, well, I'm at the national office, which is not in the capital. I could at least go to the capital to be where the embassy is. Now, this, you see, is, you might say, a decision of principle, that there's something more you can do, and you can do it. It wasn't really a sensible decision, because if the embassy was going to contact anywhere, it would contact the National Assembly office. But he felt that was something he could do. So he went to the capital, and as he was approaching the gate to the embassy, a lady came from the other side, and he stepped back to allow her to go through the gate first. And she said, "Thank you very much. Is there some way I can help you?" And he said, "Well, actually, yes, I have a letter I have to give to the ambassador." He said, "Oh, well, come with me, I'm his secretary." Now, you see, this is where practicality and faith interlink. That there are things that we know we have to do, and we think we're incompetent, we can't do it. if we pick ourselves up and start to do it, that's when Baha'u'llah comes in and does things. I remember the Hand of the Cause, Paul Haney, saying once that he had this often when he was given tasks by the House of Justice. He was the hand who often used to go to visit the officials in Jerusalem. He was very useful, actually. He's a very tall man. So if it was a big gathering, I remember I went with him on at least one occasion to a presidential reception. And we were all gathered round, crammed in this room. And he wanted to know when the president came in. The president wasn't such a big man. And Paul was like a periscope above everybody else. And so as soon as he saw the president enter the room, he'd say, "Come with me." You see, and he'd come across and he'd see the president. Anyway, so he was used to going to deal with officials. And but he said once that time and again, the House of Justice would ask him to undertake a particular job. He couldn't see the wisdom of doing this. And he wasn't quite sure it was the right thing to do anyway, I mean, from a personal point of view. But the House of Justice had said, do it. So he said he would begin to do it. As he worked at it, door after door would open in front of him. And it would be fine, and he would go and do it. But if he just thought of all the problems, not, well, I can't really do it, and how else can we manage things, it would never have got done. So it's this combination of trust in Baha'u'llah, reliance on him, and using our own good thinking machinery to do what we think is best that will help the faith. So this involvement of the National Assemblies, of course, has a tremendous effect on the relationship of the faith to the public generally. There's a lovely thing happened in America. Again, I may have told you, I hope not. My memory is so bad I tell you things several times. In Washington, there were Baha'is who happened to overhear two members of the State Department talking to one another. And the matter at issue was a report of something was happening in Iran. And they weren't quite sure whether this report could be relied on or not. And one of these State Department people said to the other one, have you checked with Wilmette? Now, this is extraordinary. The faith is a very small thing in America in a sense, but you see the intimacy. Two things. One is, if Wilmette said it's okay, it's okay. And that's the reputation we establish. The other is that the faith is so well known that one State Department member could refer to another, speak to another about Wilmette. Not the headquarters of the Baha'is in Chicago, but just Wilmette, and you know what they're talking about. This is a tremendous step forward. Another one, I'm told, is that when the faith becomes a subject of cartoons and newspapers, then we've really got there. Part of the success of the faith, particularly in relation to the United Nations, has been the uniqueness of the Baha'i response to persecution. Because we aren't the only people in the world being persecuted. There are millions and millions of them. Yes. In the book it mentions that here. He says, the 20th century has, alas, been overwhelmed by the suffering of countless victims of oppression. What made the Baha'i situation unique was the attitude adopted by those who endured the suffering. The Iranian believers refused to accept the all too familiar role of victims. Like the founders of the faith before them, they took moral charge of the great issue between them and their adversaries. It was they, not revolutionary courts or revolutionary guards, who quickly set the terms of the encounter. And this extraordinary achievement affected not only the hearts, but the minds of those who observed the situation from outside the Baha'i faith. The persecuted community neither attacked its oppressors, nor sought political advantage from the crisis. Nor did its Baha'i defenders in other lands call for the dismantling of the Iranian constitution, much less for revenge. All demanded only justice, the recognition of the rights guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, endorsed by the community of nations, ratified by the Iranian government, and many of them embodied even in clauses of the Islamic constitution. So this dignity and self-confidence and lack of vengefulness is an incredible thing you find in the Baha'i case, and it has had a profound effect, particularly on the United Nations. We've shown how the Human Rights Commission and its various agencies can work. Now this strengthened the Human Rights Commission, and there were other things happened in the world which greatly strengthened the public situation of the faith. One was in Germany. Yes, so two outstanding examples suggest the character and importance of these advances. The first was achieved by the National Spiritual Assembly of Germany, where the nature of Baha'i elected bodies had been challenged by local authorities as being technically incompatible with the requirements of German civil law. Now, what they were saying was that you cannot have one institution, namely a local spiritual assembly, under the authority of another incorporated institution in Germany. You can't have one company under the authority of another, and therefore the Baha'i constitution is unacceptable. And they were going to disincorporate the local assembly of Tübingen. In upholding the appeal of the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Tübingen against this ruling, Germany's constitutional high court concluded that the Baha'i administrative order is an integral feature of the faith, and as such is inseparable from Baha'i belief. The High Court justified its taking jurisdiction in the case by adducing evidence that the Baha'i faith itself is a religion, a judgment with far-reaching implications in a society where church opponents have long sought to misrepresent the cause as a cult or sect. You see, there's a principle in German law that divine law supersedes civil law. I think they've got this for years because of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church there. The definitive language of the judgment merits repetition, and this is the background to its decision which the Supreme Court adduced. He says, the character of the Baha'i faith as a religion and of the Baha'i community as a religious community is evident in actual everyday life, in cultural tradition, and in the understanding of the general public, as well as of the science of comparative religion. That's one thing after another. So if anybody says, oh, you're not really an independent religion, here we have a decision of the German Federal Constitutional Court producing all these evidences. And then they said it was left to the Brazilian Baha'i community to win a victory on the field of external affairs that is so far unique in Baha'i history. On 28 May 1992, its country's highest legislative body, the Chamber of Deputies, held a special session to pay tribute to Baha'u'llah on the centenary of his ascension. The speaker read a message from the Universal House of Justice, and representatives of all the parties arose, one by one, to acknowledge the contribution to human betterment of the faith and its founder. A moving address by one prominent deputy described the Baha'i teachings as, quote, the most colossal religious work ever written by the pen of a single man. That is the Federal Parliament of Brazil. And Brazil is quite a country. Now, so these things have been happening in this part of the development of the faith. And I'm mentioning them because one tends to forget these sometimes. And they are very, very important in understanding the rise of the Baha'i administrative order in relation to the problems of the world. At the time of the, do you remember at the end of the century there was a Millennium Assembly held by the United Nations. There were a number of Millennium things organized by the United Nations. And yes, it says the changes wrought in humanity's social and moral life received powerful endorsement as a series of international gatherings called under United Nations authority to mark the approaching end of one millennium and the beginning of a new one. On the 22nd, 26th May 2000, representatives of over 1,000 non-governmental organizations assembled in New York at the invitation of Kofi Annan, United Nations Secretary General. In the statement that emerged from this meeting, spokespersons of civil society committed their organizations to the ideal that, quote, we are one human family, in all our diversity, living on one common homeland, and sharing a just, sustainable, and peaceful world, guided by universal principles of democracy. So shortly afterwards, from 28 to 31 May 2000, a second gathering brought together leaders of most of the world's religious communities, likewise assembled at the United Nations headquarters. The Baha'i international community was represented by its Secretary General, who addressed one of the plenary sessions. No observer could fail to be struck by the call of the world's religious leaders, formally, for their communities to respect the right to freedom of religion, to seek reconciliation, and to engage in mutual forgiveness and healing. And yes, nothing so dramatically illustrates the difference between the world of 1900 and that of 2000 than the text of the summit resolution signed by all the participants and referred by them to the United Nations General Assembly. Quote, we solemnly reaffirm on this historic occasion that the United Nations is the indispensable common house of the entire human family, through which we will seek to realize our universal aspirations for peace, cooperation, and development. We therefore pledge our unstinting support for these common objectives and our determination to achieve them. And in concluding this sequence of historic meetings, Mr. Annan addressed himself to the assembled world leaders in surprisingly candid terms that, for many Baha'is, carried echoes of Baha'u'llah's stern admonition to the now vanished kings and emperors who had been these leaders' predecessors. Quote, it lies in your power, and therefore it is your responsibility to reach the goals that you have defined. Only you can determine whether the United Nations rises to the challenge. And that, for Kofi Annan, is pretty strong wording. The world as a whole and the media showed a cynical lack of interest to the whole of these events in the United Nations at the turn of the millennium. It really was something, they thought it was nice window dressing, nothing very important. But it was of fundamental importance. Somewhere. Sorry, I was going to quote something which I don't think I have anymore. Still, sorry. This is part of this whole procedure. Oh, here we are. Yes, this is it. Sorry, I leapt ahead too far. You remember when Abdul Baha was in visiting Britain? He was invited to Edinburgh, and he stayed with the house of Mrs. White, who was the wife of, I think he was a moderator of the Church of Scotland. Any Scotsmen here who know that? Was it the Free Church or the Church? Free Church of Scotland. Okay. There's so many different Presbyterian churches in Scotland, it gets quite bewildering. The very famous letter he wrote to her afterwards contains the matter of the 7 candles of unity. And I want to finish by reading this particular part because it gives us an insight into the process that's taking place. And Abdul Baha wrote to Mrs. White, O honored lady, behold how that's unity's light, is now dawning upon the world's darkened horizons. The first candle is unity in the political realm, the early glimmerings of which can now be discerned. The second candle is unity of thought in world undertakings, the consummation of which will ere long be witnessed. The third candle is unity in freedom, which will surely come to pass. The fourth candle is unity in religion, which is the cornerstone of the foundation itself, and which, by the power of God, will be revealed in all its splendor. The fifth candle is the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. The sixth candle is unity of races, making of all that dwell on earth peoples and kindreds of one race. The seventh candle is unity of language, i.e. the choice of a universal tongue in which all peoples will be instructed and converse. Each and every one of these will inevitably come to pass, inasmuch as the power of the kingdom of God will aid and assist in their realization. Now, there's a tendency sometimes to think of these as having to come in that order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That isn't so. And this book comments on the fulfillment of these, or the lighting of these candles, in a way that I think is very interesting. Remember, the House of Justice has confirmed that the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland, has been established. You just look at the world. This is not a matter of the unity of the states. The unity of states is a different thing. If something happens in China, or they have a tsunami in Indonesia, the whole world's upset and worried about it. Nothing happens in the world nowadays that gets in the news that people don't respond to as fellow human beings of the people affected. So now this has to improve. Everything happens gradually, but at least we got there in this century. Now he says, while it will be decades, or perhaps a great deal longer, before the vision contained in this remarkable document is fully realized, the essential features of what it promised are now established facts throughout the world. In several of the great changes envisioned, unity of race and unity of religion, the intent of the Master's words is clear and the processes involved are far advanced, however great may be the resistance in some quarters. To a large extent, this is also true of unity of language. The need for it is now recognized on all sides, as reflected in the circumstances that have compelled the United Nations and much of the non-governmental community to adopt several official languages. Until a decision is taken by international agreement, the effect of such developments as the Internet, the management of air traffic, the development of technological vocabularies of various kinds, and universal education itself has been to make it possible, to some extent, for English to fill the gap. So that, in other words, whatever the government will eventually choose, the governments of the world will have to choose something because it has to be taught in the schools of the world. That's why it isn't for the Baha'is to decide which is the international language. But in practice, nowadays in many areas it's English. I remember being particularly struck by the statement that when an Italian airliner is landing in Rome, the language between the airliner and the directing in Rome, it must be in English. You can't have lots of people talking different languages in airliners because it drives everyone crazy. And in the country we come from, Louise and I, Switzerland, in practical point of view, the National Assembly always consults in English. It's the only common language. One of the members is German speaking, he doesn't speak French or Italian. So the only way they can avoid translating is to all speak in English, which they all speak. So this is a movement of fact which has yet to be, shall we say, legalized. Now, unity of thought in world undertakings, a concept for which the most idealistic aspirations at the opening of the 20th century lacked even reference points, is also in large measure everywhere apparent in vast programs of social and economic development, humanitarian aid, and concern for protection of the environment of the planet and its oceans. As to unity in the political realm, Shoghi Effendi has explained that the reference is to unity which sovereign states achieve among themselves, a developing process at the present stage of which is the establishment of the United Nations. The Master's promise of unity of nations, on the other hand, looked forward to today's widespread acceptance among the peoples of the world of the fact that however great the differences among them may be, they are the inhabitants of a single global homeland. Unity and freedom has today, of course, become a universal aspiration of the Earth's inhabitants. Among the chief developments giving substance to it, the Master may well have had in mind the dramatic extinction of colonialism and the consequent rise of self-determination as a dominant feature of national identity at century's end. Whatever threats still hang over humanity's future, the world has been transformed by the events of the 20th century. That the features of the process should also have been described by the voice that predicted it with such confidence ought to command earnest reflection on the part of serious minds everywhere. Now, this isn't quite the end of the book, but it's basically the summary of the contents of this book. But I do urge you all, when you can get the time among all your other activities, to read through it, because, and also, if possible, when if you haven't already done it, read the Guardian's World Order letters, because when we understand what's happening in the world and the spiritual significance of what's happening, we get less distracted by the world's events from the tasks that we have to perform. The world can be a very worrying place, and there are some things that are ours to worry about, and we can do something about. Others we can't do anything about, and there's not much point in wasting our energy worrying about them. And we have to distinguish that and concentrate our efforts on the focus that the Universal House of Justice has given us. So thank you very much. Thank you all very much.